The chef told me my recipe for the signature dish was all wrong. I created it. I was sitting in the back row of Julian Cross's Advanced Culinary Techniques class at the Institute of Culinary Excellence in downtown Chicago, watching him demonstrate what he called my signature creation to 30 aspiring chefs who hung on his every word. The dish was seared duck breast with cherry port reduction, crispy duck fat potatoes, and a black garlic puree, plated with microgreens and edible flowers in a very specific arrangement. I'd created every element of that dish 12 years ago when I was head chef at Vermilion, the restaurant that had put me on the map and earned me my first Michelin star. Julian had been my sous chef back then, 24 years old and hungry to learn everything I could teach him. Now he stood at the front of this gleaming demonstration kitchen, his chef's whites pristine and pressed, explaining to these students that the key to the dish was cooking the duck breast to exactly medium rare and finishing it with a torch to crisp the skin. Wrong. Completely wrong. I'd always seared it skin side down in a cold pan, rendering the fat slowly until the skin was crackling and golden, then finishing it in a 400-degree oven for exactly 6 minutes. The torch method he was demonstrating would give you unevenly cooked meat and bitter, burned skin. I watched him plate the dish, watched him drizzle the reduction in the exact pattern I'd designed, watched him place the microgreens at precisely 2 o'clock on the plate like I'd done 1,000 times, and felt my hands curl into fists on the table in front of me. I'd been living in northern Michigan for the past decade, running a small bakery in a town of 3,000 people, making sourdough bread and croissants for tourists and locals who had no idea I'd once been considered one of the most innovative young chefs in the country. After my wife Melissa died in a car accident 11 years ago, I'd had what my therapist politely called a complete mental breakdown. I'd walked away from Vermilion, from my Michelin star, from the culinary world entirely, and disappeared into grief and silence. The bakery had been therapy, a way to work with my hands and create something simple and honest without the pressure of innovation or acclaim. I'd been content there, or at least numb enough to function. But last month, I'd received an email from the Institute asking if I'd be interested in taking some advanced classes to refresh my skills, sent to an old email address I barely checked anymore. Something in me had responded to that invitation, some buried part of my chef's soul that still remembered what it felt like to create at that level. So I'd enrolled under my legal name, Daniel Reeves, paid the tuition, and driven down to Chicago for weekend intensive courses. I'd specifically chosen Julian's class because I wanted to see what had become of my former protege, the young man I'd mentored and trusted with my techniques and recipes. I'd expected to feel proud, maybe nostalgic. Instead, I was watching him claim my signature dish as his own original creation and teach it incorrectly to a room full of students who would go out into the world replicating his flawed version. When Julian finished the demonstration and asked if there were any questions, my hand went up before I could stop myself. He looked toward the back of the room, squinting slightly like he couldn't quite see me in the shadows. Yes, the gentleman in the back. His voice was smooth and confident, the voice of someone who'd spent years being interviewed by food critics and appearing on television cooking shows. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The duck breast. You're using the torch method to crisp the skin, but that's going to give you uneven cooking and a bitter flavor from the burned fat. The traditional method for this dish is to start in a cold pan, render the fat slowly, then finish in a hot oven. The room went silent. Every student turned to look at me, and I could see Julian's expression shift from polite interest to irritation in the space of a heartbeat. I appreciate your input, but I think I know my own recipe better than a first-year student. The torch method is precisely what makes this dish special. It's a technique I developed through years of experimentation. His tone was dismissive, designed to put me in my place and move on. But I couldn't move on. Not when he was standing there lying about a dish I'd poured my soul into, a dish that had been featured in Bon Appetit and Food and Wine, a dish that food critics had called revelatory, and a perfect marriage of classical technique and modern innovation. I'm not a first-year student, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And that's not your recipe. That dish was created at Vermilion in 2012 by Chef Daniel Reeves. I know because I was there. Julian's face flushed red, and I saw something flash in his eyes that looked almost like panic before his professional mask slipped back into place. Vermilion? That restaurant closed over a decade ago, and I don't know where you're getting your information, but this is absolutely my original creation. I've been making this dish for 8 years, since I opened my restaurant Crossroads. It's been featured in multiple publications under my name. He turned away from me deliberately, addressing the rest of the class. Sometimes people see similarities between dishes and assume there's been some kind of theft, but in reality, great minds often arrive at similar conclusions. Now, let's move on to the plating techniques. I sat down slowly, my legs shaking, feeling 30 pairs of eyes on me and hearing the whispered conversations starting around the room. The woman next to me, probably in her early 30s with flour still dusted on her black chef's pants, leaned over and whispered, "That was ballsy. But Cross is kind of notorious for shutting down anyone who challenges him. I'd watch your back if I were you." I barely heard her. My mind was racing through the years, trying to understand how this had happened. Julian had left Vermilion about 6 months after I did, after the restaurant closed because I'd been too broken to continue running it. He'd gone on to open Crossroads, which had quickly become one of Chicago's hottest new restaurants. I'd heard about his success in passing, through the occasional article that popped up in my social media feeds before I'd deleted all my accounts. I'd been happy for him, proud even, assuming he'd taken what I'd taught him and built his own culinary vision. I'd never imagined he'd built that vision by literally stealing mine. After class, I waited in the hallway outside the demonstration kitchen, leaning against the wall and trying to calm my breathing. Students filed past me, some glancing curiously in my direction, others studiously avoiding eye contact. When Julian finally emerged, he was talking on his phone, his voice animated and cheerful, as he discussed reservations and publicity events. He saw me waiting, and his expression hardened, but he finished his conversation before approaching me. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but I don't appreciate being called a liar in front of my students. If you have a problem with my teaching methods, you can take it up with the administration. Otherwise, I'd suggest you drop this class and find somewhere else to study." He started to walk past me, but I stepped into his path. Up close, I could see he'd aged well, his dark hair now touched with distinguished gray at the temples, his face lined in ways that made him look experienced rather than old. He'd always been handsome in that sharp, angular way that looked good in photographs. Now he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd become exactly what he'd always wanted to be. "Julian, it's me, Daniel Reeves." I watched his face carefully, looking for recognition, for acknowledgement, for something that would tell me this was all a misunderstanding. For a moment, his professional mask slipped, and I saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been guilt or fear or both. Then it was gone, replaced by carefully constructed confusion. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" The denial was so absolute, so convincing, that for a second I questioned my own reality. But no, I'd mentored this man for 3 years. I'd taught him everything from knife skills to plating aesthetics. I'd shared my recipes, my techniques, my philosophy about food and cooking. There was no possible way he didn't recognize me, even with the extra weight I'd gained and the gray in my beard that hadn't been there 12 years ago. "You were my sous chef at Vermilion. I taught you how to make that duck dish you just demonstrated. You know exactly who I am." Julian's expression shifted to something that looked like pity mixed with annoyance. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but I've never heard of you. I've never worked at a restaurant called Vermilion, and I certainly didn't steal anyone's recipes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another class to teach." He pushed past me and walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floors. I stood there for a long moment, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief, before pulling out my phone and doing something I should have done years ago. I Googled myself. The results were sparse and outdated, most of the links broken from websites that no longer existed. But I found a few archived articles from 2011 and 2012, reviews of Vermilion that mentioned my name, a short interview in a local food blog where I'd talked about the inspiration behind my signature duck dish. I screenshot everything, my fingers clumsy on the phone's screen, building a file of evidence that I'd existed, that I'd created what Julian was now claiming as his own. That evening, I sat in my hotel room with my laptop open, searching for everything I could find about Julian Cross and his restaurant Crossroads. His website was sleek and professional, featuring photos of dishes that looked hauntingly familiar. There was the duck breast I'd just watched him demonstrate, but also a deconstructed bouillabaisse that I'd created in 2011, a maple bourbon pork belly that had been my winter special for 2 years running, and a chocolate soufflé with cardamom cream that I'd developed after a trip to India. Each dish was presented as Chef Julian Cross's signature creation, each one accompanied by a story about his inspiration and development process. The stories were good, I had to admit, detailed and plausible, full of the kind of personal anecdotes that made you feel like you were getting an intimate glimpse into a chef's creative process. The problem was, they were all lies. I'd created every single one of those dishes, and I had the documentation to prove it. I pulled out the old external hard drive I'd brought with me, the one I'd been too emotionally damaged to look at for years. It contained photos from my time at Vermilion, recipe development notes, menu drafts, everything I'd digitally archived before walking away from my old life. I plugged it in and started going through the files, my chest tight with a mixture of nostalgia and grief. There were photos of Melissa and me at the restaurant's opening, both of us grinning like idiots, her in a black dress and me in my chef's whites, so young and full of hope. There were menu printouts showing the evolution of my duck dish from early experiments to the final version. There were notes in my own handwriting, scanned and saved, detailing every element of the dishes Julian was now claiming as his own. I spent the next 3 hours building a comparison document, putting my original recipes and photos side by side with images from Julian's website and social media. The similarities weren't just striking, they were identical. Same plating patterns, same flavor combinations, same garnishes placed in the same positions. He hadn't just been inspired by my work, he'd copied it wholesale and then rewritten history to make himself the creator. By midnight, I'd compiled a 45-page document with timestamps, archived articles, photos, and recipe cards that proved beyond any doubt that I'd created these dishes years before Julian had claimed them as his own. The question was, what to do with this information? I could go to the Institute's administration, but what would I say? That their star instructor was a fraud? They'd probably dismiss me as a delusional former chef trying to reclaim past glory. I could go public, but I had no platform anymore, no credibility in the culinary world after disappearing for a decade. I'd deleted my social media accounts, cut ties with almost everyone I'd known in the industry, become a ghost. Who would believe the ghost over the successful, celebrated chef with a thriving restaurant and television appearances? I called my old friend Marcus. Wait, I can't use that name. Let me reconsider. I called my old friend David Chen. No, can't use Chen either. I called my old friend David Sullivan, who'd been the general manager at Vermilion and one of the few people I'd kept in sporadic contact with over the years. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep. Daniel? Jesus, do you know what time it is? I need your help. It's about Julian. I heard rustling on the other end of the line, the sound of David sitting up in bed. Julian Cross? What about him? I explained everything, the class, the demonstration, the denial, the evidence I'd found. David listened in silence, and when I finished, he let out a long breath. I always wondered about that. When Crossroads opened and I saw the menu, I thought some of those dishes looked familiar, but I figured maybe you'd sold him the recipes or given him permission or something. I never thought he'd just straight up steal them and claim them as his own. His voice had shifted from sleepy to alert, tinged with the anger I was feeling. You still have the original recipe cards? The ones with your handwriting? I have everything. Photos, development notes, menu drafts, all of it. I just don't know what to do with it. David was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking. You need a lawyer. Specifically, you need an intellectual property lawyer who specializes in food industry cases. I know someone. Let me make some calls. But Daniel, you need to be prepared for this to get ugly. Julian's not going to just admit he stole from you. He's built his entire career on those recipes. If you expose him, you're going to destroy everything he's created. Good, I said, surprised by the venom in my own voice. He destroyed everything I created when he stole it. The next morning, I received an email from David with contact information for Rachel Kimura, an attorney based in Chicago, who specialized in intellectual property disputes in the restaurant industry. She had 23 years of experience and a reputation for being ruthless, but fair. I called her office at exactly 9 a.m. when they opened, and her assistant scheduled me for a consultation that afternoon. Rachel's office was in a sleek high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan, all glass and chrome and expensive art on the walls. She was in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with sharp eyes that seemed to assess everything about me in the first 30 seconds. I sat across from her and laid out my case, showing her the comparison document I'd created, the archived articles, the photos, the recipe cards. She reviewed everything methodically, taking notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and steepled her fingers. This is a strong case for recipe theft and potentially fraud, but there are complications. Recipe copyright law is notoriously murky. You can't copyright a list of ingredients or basic cooking methods. What you can protect is the specific expression of a recipe, the exact wording, the detailed instructions, the plating design if it's sufficiently unique and creative. What we have here is more of a trade secret issue combined with potential fraud and misrepresentation. She pulled out a legal pad and started sketching out the situation. Julian Cross has been publicly claiming these recipes as his original creations, which is demonstrably false based on your documentation. That's fraud. He's potentially profited from this fraud through his restaurant, his teaching fees, and any cookbooks or media appearances where he's presented these dishes as his own work. That opens him up to civil liability at minimum. Can we stop him from using the recipes? I asked. Rachel shook her head slightly. Stopping him from cooking the dishes would be extremely difficult. Like I said, you can't really own a recipe in that way. But what we can do is expose the truth, demand public correction and attribution, seek damages for fraud and misrepresentation, and destroy his credibility. If he's built his reputation on stolen recipes, proving that theft will effectively end his career in the fine dining world. Reputation is everything in your industry. She pulled out a contract and slid it across the desk. My retainer is $15,000, and this case could take 6 months to a year depending on how hard Cross fights it. But based on what I'm seeing here, I think we can win. The question is whether you're prepared for what comes next. This will be public, messy. People will take sides. Your own past will be examined. Are you ready for that? I thought about the quiet life I'd built in northern Michigan, the anonymity I'd wrapped around myself like armor. I thought about my little bakery and my regular customers who knew me as Daniel the baker, not Daniel the failed chef who'd disappeared after his wife died. Going public with this would mean dragging all of that back into the light, facing questions about why I'd walked away, why I'd let Julian steal from me without fighting back. But I also thought about those 30 students in Julian's class, learning techniques wrong, building their culinary education on lies. I thought about every interview where Julian had talked about his creative process and his signature dishes, stealing not just my recipes, but my voice, my philosophy, my approach to food. I'm ready, I said, and signed the retainer agreement. Rachel nodded approvingly and made a note on her pad. Good. First step is to send a cease and desist letter to Cross and to the Institute, demanding that he stop claiming these recipes as his original creations and that he issue a public correction. We'll include your documentation as evidence. This will likely provoke a response, either denial or an attempt to settle quietly. Based on what you've told me about his personality, I'm guessing denial. She was right. 3 days later, I received a forwarded email from Rachel containing Julian's response, sent through his own attorney. The letter was 2 pages of legal language that boiled down to, "My client has never heard of Daniel Reeves, has never worked at a restaurant called Vermilion, and considers these accusations to be defamatory and potentially actionable. Mr. Reeves is advised to cease and desist from making these false claims or face legal consequences." Attached to the letter was a sworn affidavit from Julian stating that he had developed all of his signature dishes independently, that he had never stolen recipes from anyone, and that he had documentation of his own creative process. The audacity of it made my hands shake as I read. He wasn't just denying the theft, he was threatening to sue me for pointing it out. Rachel called me that evening, her voice calm and professional. "This is what I expected. He's doubling down, betting that you won't have the resources or the will to fight him. Now we escalate. I'm going to file a civil complaint for fraud, misrepresentation, and unjust enrichment. We'll seek damages based on the profits he's made from using your recipes at his restaurant, his teaching income, and any other revenue streams connected to these dishes. And we're going to make sure this gets media attention." Media attention? My stomach clenched at the thought. Daniel, the best way to fight this is in the court of public opinion as well as the actual court. The culinary world is small and gossip travels fast. If we can get a food journalist or critic to cover this story, it will put pressure on Cross to settle or admit the truth. I have contacts at several food publications. With your permission, I'd like to reach out to them. I thought about it for a long moment, weighing my desire for privacy against my need for justice. "Do it," I finally said. "But I want to be the one to tell the story. If this is going public, it should be in my own words." 2 days later, I was sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, across from Amanda Reyes, a food journalist for Chicago Magazine who'd been covering the restaurant scene for 15 years. She'd agreed to meet me after Rachel had sent her a preview of the evidence, and now she sat with her notebook open and a digital recorder on the table between us, her expression a mixture of skepticism and interest. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Amanda said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "You're claiming that Julian Cross, one of Chicago's most celebrated chefs, built his reputation by stealing recipes from you, a chef who disappeared from the industry over a decade ago. And you have proof of this?" I pulled out my laptop and walked her through everything, the same comparison document I'd shown Rachel, the archived articles, the photos of dishes from Vermilion that were identical to dishes now on Crossroads' menu. I showed her recipe cards in my own handwriting, dated and photographed, showing the development of each dish. I showed her the menu from Vermilion's final year, featuring every dish Julian was now claiming as his own. Amanda took notes rapidly, occasionally asking me to pause so she could photograph certain documents with her phone. As I talked, I watched her expression shift from skeptical to engaged, to something that looked almost like excitement. This was a story, and she knew it. "This is explosive," she said when I finished. "If this is true, if you can prove all of this, it's the biggest scandal to hit Chicago's food scene in years. But I have to ask the obvious question. Why now? Why wait 12 years to come forward?" I'd known this question was coming, had rehearsed my answer, but it still hurt to say it out loud. My wife died 11 years ago. I had a breakdown. I left the industry completely and moved away to heal. I didn't know Julian was claiming my recipes until I enrolled in his class last week. Once I found out, I couldn't let it continue. Amanda's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry about your wife, but you understand that people are going to ask why you didn't speak up sooner, why you let him build his career on your work for over a decade." "Because I was barely surviving," I said, hearing the raw honesty in my own voice. "Because I was too broken to care about recipes or restaurants or any of it. Because I thought none of it mattered anymore. But it does matter. Those dishes were the last things I created before my life fell apart. They're connected to some of the happiest memories I have. And watching someone else claim them, teach them wrong, profit from them, it's like watching someone steal pieces of my past." Amanda was quiet for a moment, and I could see her processing the emotional weight of what I'd just said. "I want to run this story, but I need to verify everything independently. I'll need to contact sources who can confirm you worked at Vermilion, that these recipes are yours, that the timeline matches what you're claiming. I'll also need to reach out to Julian Cross for comment. This is going to take about 2 weeks to fact-check and write. Are you prepared for what happens when this publishes?" "I don't think I'll ever be prepared," I admitted. "But it needs to be told." Over the next 2 weeks, Amanda did exactly what she'd promised. She tracked down David Sullivan and interviewed him about my time at Vermilion. She found the restaurant's former owner, who confirmed that I'd been the head chef and that the dishes in question had been created during my tenure. She even found a food blogger who'd reviewed Vermilion in 2012 and still had photos of my duck dish, proving it existed years before Julian claimed to have created it. She reached out to Julian for comment, and according to Rachel, his attorney sent back a terse statement denying all allegations and threatening legal action if the article was published. 2 days before the article was scheduled to run, I received a phone call from an unknown number. When I answered, I heard Julian's voice for the first time, without his professional polish raw and angry. "You're really going to do this? You're going to destroy everything I've built over some fucking recipes?" His voice was shaking with rage. "You walked away, Daniel. You abandoned everything. You have no right to come back now and tear down what I've created." "What you've created?" I felt my own anger rising to match his. "You didn't create anything, Julian. You stole my work and passed it off as your own. You built your entire reputation on lies." "I made those recipes better than you ever did," he spat back. "Your duck was good, but my version is perfect. I refined your techniques, improved on your plating, turned your rough drafts into masterpieces. Without me, those recipes would have died when Vermilion closed. I kept them alive. I made them famous. I deserve the credit for that." The sheer arrogance of it took my breath away. "You deserve credit for stealing and lying? You deserve credit for teaching those dishes wrong and claiming you invented them? You're delusional." "I'm giving you one chance to back off," Julian said, his voice dropping to something cold and threatening. "Drop the lawsuit, call off your journalist friend, walk away. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what a pathetic has-been you are. I'll tell them how you abandoned your restaurant, how you couldn't handle the pressure, how you disappeared like a coward. I'll destroy what's left of your reputation." "I don't have a reputation left to destroy," I said quietly. "But you do. And when that article runs, everyone will know the truth about how you got it." He hung up without another word. That call was the last communication I had with Julian before the article published. When it hit Chicago Magazine's website on a Thursday morning, it exploded across food media like a grease fire. The headline read, "Stolen Recipes, How One of Chicago's Top Chefs Built His Career on Another Man's Work." Amanda had written it beautifully, laying out the evidence methodically while weaving in the human story of my loss and Julian's betrayal. She'd included photos comparing dishes from Vermilion and Crossroads, showing the undeniable similarities. She'd interviewed multiple sources who confirmed my version of events. Within hours, the story had been picked up by Eater, Bon Appetit, and Food and Wine. By that afternoon, it was trending on culinary Twitter and Instagram, with chefs and food writers weighing in on both sides. Some defended Julian, arguing that recipe inspiration wasn't theft and that I was a bitter has-been trying to tear down someone more successful. But more people, many more, were outraged on my behalf. Former Vermilion customers came forward with photos and memories of my dishes. Other chefs who'd worked with Julian started sharing their own stories of him taking credit for other people's ideas. The dam had broken, and everything that had been hidden was flooding into the light. The Institute of Culinary Excellence issued a statement that evening saying they were investigating the allegations, and that Julian Cross had been placed on administrative leave from his teaching position pending the outcome of the investigation. Crossroads Restaurant tried to weather the storm at first, posting a statement on their website defending Julian and claiming the allegations were false. But reservations started getting canceled. Food critics who'd once praised the restaurant were now writing articles questioning whether anything on the menu was original. Two of Julian's sous chefs quit publicly, posting on social media that they could no longer work for someone who'd built his career on theft. 3 days after the article published, Julian called a press conference. I watched it on my laptop from my hotel room, my hands clenched into fists as he stood in front of a podium at Crossroads, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his expression a carefully crafted mixture of hurt and defiance. "I want to address the recent allegations that have been made against me," he began, his voice steady and controlled. "Daniel Reeves was indeed my mentor many years ago, and I learned a great deal from him during my time at Vermilion. However, the claim that I stole his recipes is categorically false." He went on to explain his version of events, that he'd been inspired by his time working with me, that he'd taken the techniques I'd taught him and developed his own interpretations, that this was normal in the culinary world where chefs build on each other's work. He claimed that the similarities between his dishes and mine were the natural result of being trained in the same style, not evidence of theft. He expressed sympathy for my loss and my struggles, but firmly denied any wrongdoing. It was a masterclass in manipulation, the way he acknowledged just enough truth to seem credible while denying the core accusation. If I hadn't had the documentation, if I hadn't been able to prove that his dishes were identical to mine down to the plating patterns, it might have worked. But I did have the proof, and Rachel was ready to use it. The civil lawsuit was filed the following week, and with it came a flood of additional evidence that Rachel and her team had been gathering. They'd subpoenaed records from Crossroads showing that Julian's signature dishes had appeared on the menu within months of the restaurant opening, before he would have had time to develop them independently. They'd found interviews from Julian's early days where he'd talked about refining recipes from my time at Vermilion, a slip that proved he knew exactly where the dishes had come from. They'd even tracked down a former line cook from Crossroads who was willing to testify that Julian kept copies of Vermilion's old menus in his office and regularly consulted them. The case was airtight, and Julian's attorneys knew it. 2 months after the lawsuit was filed, they approached Rachel about a settlement. Julian was willing to admit that he'd been inspired by my recipes, to issue a public apology, and to pay damages in exchange for avoiding a trial. Rachel called me to discuss the offer, laying out the terms. "He's offering $350,000 in damages, a public statement acknowledging that you created the dishes in question, and an agreement to remove those dishes from his menu permanently. It's a good offer, Daniel. Taking this to trial could take another year, and there's always risk, even with a strong case. I thought about it for a long moment, weighing the money against the satisfaction of watching Julian face judgment in open court. What happens if we don't settle? What's the likely outcome of a trial? Based on the evidence we have, I'd say there's an 85% chance we win with substantial damages. But there's also the publicity aspect. A trial would keep this story in the media for months. It would be exhausting and invasive for you, and it would completely destroy what's left of Julian's career. The settlement lets both of you move on. I don't want to move on, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I want a trial. I want him to have to stand up in court and admit what he did. I want it on the record. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Okay. But understand that this means your entire past will be examined. Julian's attorneys will try to discredit you, will dig into your breakdown, your time away from the industry, anything they can use to make you look unreliable. Are you sure you're ready for that? I'm sure. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later, giving both sides time to prepare. During that period, I watched Julian's career crumble in slow motion. Crossroads closed 3 months before the trial date, unable to survive the constant negative publicity and the mass exodus of staff. Julian's television appearances were canceled. His planned cookbook was shelved by the publisher. The Institute of Culinary Excellence formally terminated his teaching contract and issued a public apology to students who'd been taught under false pretenses. By the time we walked into the courtroom on the first day of the trial, Julian looked diminished, his expensive suits no longer fitting quite right, his confident swagger replaced by something hunched and defensive. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Rachel presented our evidence methodically, calling witness after witness who testified to my creation of the disputed recipes. David Sullivan took the stand and walked the jury through menu development meetings where I'd introduced each dish. The former owner of Vermilion testified about my creative process and my role as head chef. Food critics who'd reviewed my cooking in 2011 and 2012 confirmed that the dishes had existed under my tenure. Julian's defense tried to argue that inspiration wasn't theft, that he'd transformed my rough concepts into polished dishes, that I was a vindictive ex-colleague trying to destroy him out of jealousy. But their arguments fell apart when Rachel presented the side-by-side comparisons, showing that Julian's dishes weren't transformations or interpretations. They were exact replicas down to the garnish placement and plate choice. The most damaging moment came when Rachel played a video from one of Julian's early cooking demonstrations, found in a local news archive, where he'd made the duck breast dish and casually mentioned that he'd refined this technique during my time working under a talented but troubled chef in the early 2010s. He'd been so confident that no one would ever connect those dots, so certain that I'd disappeared forever, that he'd basically admitted the truth without realizing it. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they came back, the verdict was unanimous. Julian Cross had engaged in fraud, misrepresentation, and unjust enrichment by claiming my recipes as his original creations. The damages awarded were $580,000, more than the settlement offer, covering estimated profits from the dishes at Crossroads, his teaching income, and punitive damages for the deliberate nature of the fraud. I watched Julian's face as the verdict was read, watched him crumble in his chair, his attorney's hand on his shoulder the only thing keeping him upright. There was no satisfaction in seeing him destroyed, just a hollow sense of justice finally served. After the trial, I gave one more interview to Amanda Reyes, who'd been covering the case from beginning to end. We met at the same coffee shop where we'd first talked, and this time her questions were softer, more reflective. How does it feel, getting your recipes back, your reputation restored? I thought about the question carefully. It doesn't feel like I got them back. Those dishes are still connected to a time and place that doesn't exist anymore. Vermilion is gone, Melissa is gone, the version of myself that created those recipes is gone. What I got back is the truth. The acknowledgement that I created something meaningful, something good enough that someone else wanted to steal it and build a career on it. That matters. What's next for you? Are you going to come back to the fine dining world? I smiled and shook my head. No. I'm going back to my bakery in Michigan. I'm going to keep making bread and croissants for people who just want something warm and good to eat. Maybe someday I'll create new recipes, new dishes that belong to this version of myself instead of the person I used to be. But right now, I'm okay with simple. The article she wrote from that interview was gentler than her first piece, focusing less on the scandal and more on the human cost of what had happened. She wrote about creativity and ownership, about the difference between inspiration and theft, about how the culinary world needed to do better at protecting the intellectual property of chefs who poured their hearts into their work. 6 months after the trial, I was back in northern Michigan, standing in my bakery at 4:30 in the morning, my hands deep in sourdough dough, the familiar rhythm of kneading grounding me in the present. The bakery had become something different to me now, not a hiding place, but a choice. I'd proven I could fight for my work, could stand up to someone who'd stolen from me, could survive having my past dragged into the light. Now I was choosing this quieter life not out of fear or grief, but out of genuine contentment. The money from the settlement sat in my bank account, mostly untouched. I'd donated a portion to a culinary scholarship fund for students who couldn't afford tuition, had set aside some for eventual retirement, and used a small amount to upgrade my bakery's equipment. The rest just sat there, a numerical acknowledgement of what had been taken from me, but not a replacement for it. I still thought about Julian sometimes, wondering what he was doing now that his restaurant was closed, his reputation destroyed, his career in fine dining effectively over. I'd heard through the culinary gossip network that he was working as a private chef for a wealthy family in the suburbs, cooking meals in anonymity, using someone else's recipes because he'd never learned to create his own. There was a kind of poetic justice in that, I supposed. As I shaped the morning's loaves and set them for their final proof, I thought about the students who'd been in that first class, the ones who'd watched me challenge Julian and had probably written me off as a crazy person. Some of them had reached out after the trial, apologizing for doubting me, asking if I'd ever consider teaching. I'd politely declined. I wasn't interested in teaching technique or recipes. If I ever had something to share with young chefs, it would be this. Create your own voice, your own vision, your own path. Don't steal from those who came before you. Build on their work, acknowledge their influence, but make something new that's genuinely yours. The sun was starting to rise over Lake Michigan, sending pale light through my bakery's windows. I pulled the first batch of croissants from the oven, their layers perfectly golden and flaky, and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with acclaim or recognition. This was enough. This was mine. This was, and no one could take it away. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.